Chris, thank you very much for that conversation. Chair Waters, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to hear your thoughts, and Chair Brown as well. I'm Aaron Klein. I'm a senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution, and we're going to now head directly from this conversation into the kinds of solutions and barriers that technology can pose for CDFIs and MDIs as they seek to scale and compete with legacy institutions. For this conversation, I am delighted to welcome Dominique Harrison, the Director of Technology Policy at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. Kyla Sanders, the CEO of REMI, Manny Alvarez, the Commissioner of the California Department of Financial Protection and Innovation, and Melissa Coity, the CEO of FinReg Labs. I'd like to welcome everybody to our Brady Bunch Zoom boxes. We've all made it through to the technological next step, and let's try to get to the intellectual next step, because I think it's time for a dose of honesty and reality, which is deeply depressing, similar to what Chair Waters said about the actual origins of Juneteenth. Everybody's been saying for 40 years that they're against racism and that they're here to fix the problem. But the data show the problem has gotten worse, not better. Financial technology has improved, and the white-black gap in society has not shrunk, but grown. There's no new magical platitude left for a person to say to fix the solution. Yet we're confronted constantly with officials reciting platitudes, and the problems metastasize. So look, is there a new financial technology that CDFIs and MDIs can employ to fix this problem? Or is everybody just blowing more smoke under the rubric of addressing racism? But really the system just keeps going and going and going. Against that backdrop, Melissa, I mean, you're out there with a lab thinking about new financial regulations to fix this problem and technology to fix this problem. Does this new solution exist? Oh, let's unmute. That should start us there.
I will. Yes. Thank you, Aaron. It's a pleasure to be a part of this conversation. And Chris and the rest of the team, thanks for having me join this conversation. I really do appreciate the opportunity to really hone in and focus on what's the role of the financial system ultimately in bringing equity, equality, and opportunity to all of our communities and all of our families and households. I can't help, Aaron, with your lead in to sort of harken back to our time sitting in the U.S. Treasury Department together, where we know that ultimately overcoming inequality and generating opportunities for everybody to be a part of it sits in part on the financial system, but it also sits on many other aspects of policy decision-making, wealth opportunities, the tax system, our higher education system. And you and I have spent a lot of time thinking about those. I will join you in a level of calibrated optimism and cynicism, because we're sitting in a really pivotal moment where it really is about how are we setting the rules of the road so that we are ensuring the benefits of technology. And with that, it's undergirded by data so that those benefits are ultimately accruing to everyone and they're not exacerbating the inequalities that we've seen in the past. And I think that's a lot of hard work that you and many others are really trying to do to understand how do we get the rules of the road right. I just want to say at the start, I think it is nevertheless encouraging how much attention and energy and resources are being brought to bear in terms of elevating the roles of minority depository institutions and CDFIs. I think, though, as it was said in the first panel this morning, getting those resources deployed in ways that aren't just sort of distributing capital in this moment, but really changing how decisions in the financial system are made and how minority depository institutions and CDFIs have the wherewithal to bring the products and services that are going to provide not just payments and credit opportunities, but wealth building opportunities to their constituencies is a really important piece of what we need to be doing to leverage and elevate MDIs and CDFIs. I will say at the start as well, these institutions play a really pivotal role in how we understand where the potential benefits of technology and data really sit. These institutions have the credibility, they have the trust of their communities. And I think how these institutions end up leveraging data and technology and deploying it, and how that information comes back to inform the safe way, the fair way, the inclusive way, credit is distributed, wealth building products are offered. I think that's going to be really informative to Chairwoman Waters' point. They're a small part of the system, but they have a really sort of pivotal role to play in terms of informing the broader financial system about how we are in the end going to be using data and technology for equity, inclusion, and in a fair way.
So I'm hoping, Kayla, that fires you up to jump in, because you're actually bringing technology to bear on this situation. I mean, all I'm seeing among financial regulators are platitudes and verbiage. Yeah. While they run around making sure that extreme holders of wealth get bailed out at the first sign of financial instability, and then, leave it to a speech hoping other people will solve systemic racism. So what's your company doing?
Yes. So here's my take on this. Resources are one thing. Actionable change or actionable tools or infrastructure, a completely different story, right? We've been talking about these things for so long. As someone who, I thought I was part of the solution until I realized I might be part of the problem, and creating something that was just a piece of the puzzle. We need a lot of those pieces to fix all of it, but really we need to figure out how to work together in a more effective, efficient, and urgent way. This is not a problem that can be solved, that we have 5 years to solve. This is a now problem, and we're still addressing it as if we have years to solve it. And I think we really have to think about who's involved, what their role is, and identify and kind of segment those so that we can move forward more quickly. I think it's a private, it's a public, it's a tech, everyone needs to come together to help solve this problem. And without the collective unity of those groups, we're going to continue to have these circular conversations. So, I'm at a point where I came from the regulatory space. So I believe, regulation is incredibly important. But however, when we have to look at if the rules and regulations we have in place today hinder the growth or the equality that we're trying to achieve. And I would say that today it absolutely does. When you're telling these large banks to lend more to these groups that based on regulations, they can put 8% of their money into, how do we, that's their max. So whether they have $1 billion, $10 billion, or $10 to lend, it's still a small percentage they can lend to this risky population. And I think, the other thing is really looking at how we judge an individual or a business's ability to borrow. We look at credit scoring is a huge problem. We have 25 million credit invisible individuals in this country. And these are people who do pay bills, who have businesses, who pay taxes. That is not acceptable. And we really need to work to figure out how to, one, make them feel comfortable even participating. Because I don't think part of them, half of them don't feel comfortable participating in this system. They don't trust the system. But then we need to make it accessible to them. And that means making it accessible via text message, via their cellular phone, not just at a branch or not just online, but something that they really can have access to. So I'll stop on my rant there.
I'm hoping that rant inspires Dominique to jump in, or else you're going to hear my rant about how the Office of Comptroller of the Currency, who showed up today with plenty of platitudes, has consistently given passing ratings to a group of 6 small banks whose entire profit model is overdrafting people who run out of money at the end of the month, who are, we know, way disproportionately people of color. And that's the entire, these aren't banks, these are check cashers with a banking charter getting regulatory pats on the back from the same institutions in Washington who come here to talk about how important it is that we tackle systemic racism and inequality, and then, hand out a financial literacy pamphlet and talk about a pilot program 3 years from now. Dominique, what do you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me again. So at the Joint Center, we're looking at critical privacy issues and big data practices that produce discriminatory outcomes for Black communities in employment, housing, credit, and lending. And there's a body of existing anti-discrimination laws and specialized enforcement agencies that have the authority to hold companies accountable for the use of personal data that results in discrimination. So while emerging technology can be great, it can also be harmful, as we've heard today. And although algorithmic lending can reduce discrimination relative to face-to-face lenders, it is insufficient to eliminate discrimination in loan pricing. The history of racial segregation in America housing policy creates a serious risk that algorithms, even if they are not motivated by a bias, will mirror and exacerbate discriminatory housing and credit lending practices and produce racial discriminatory outcomes. So payment histories, the largest factor in credit scoring, are calculated in ways that weigh against African Americans and people of color. The problem is that this data is used within algorithms about communities of color, and it's dirty data, right? So it means that it's missing data, wrong data, or data that derives from corrupt, bias, and unlawful practices, including data that has been intentionally manipulated. And so we have to continue to think about and remember that America's legacy of racial discrimination and current social inequality undermines the accuracy of fairness of data used across industries. And inclusion of more universal payment categories and universal cash flow analysis may help. It won't resolve racial disparities in credit and lending, but it can make calculations more fair. Researchers suggest that the traditional credit scoring algorithms should abandon factors that look at past behaviors to predict future repayment behavior. Instead, models should look at and focus more on other kind of payment categories, as Kayla mentioned, like cell phone payments, rent, and utilities, to evaluate individuals' payment histories against their personal cash flows so that they can be more involved in getting the kind of credit and housing opportunities that they should have available to them.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. It sounds like if FICO were a brand new if it were called an artificial intelligence, this new AI called FICO, we'd be jumping them down, screaming that it's racist and violates the law, yet somehow it's been grandfathered in by all of these regulators. And I want to turn back to Melissa in a second and talk about how we can turn some of these regulatory promises of the gobbledygook language into actual actions instead of watching more regulatory obstruction to using new technology as bank regulators. Oh, you can't make that loan. What's that person's FICO? As opposed to what's their cash flow. But Manny, you're the actual regulator on the panel. You're the person who has the seat of power here, and you're in a state that's at least trying to do the right thing, near as people say. And what have you seen on the ground where the rubber meets the road?
Thanks, Aaron, for the question and the conversation. Fundamentally, what I would say is that it is important to recognize it's been important for we here at the California Department to recognize that not all of these problems and solutions are monolithic. So I view my role as state regulator to do three fundamental things relative to our licensees to help solve some of these problems. Number one, and this is going to sound basic, but you'd be surprised how often it's overlooked. Listen to the licensees, specifically in our case, our minority depository institutions. California has 26 MDIs in our portfolio. I've recently circled wagons with a number of them, and what I would share with you all, with the audience here, the same thing that they have shared with me constantly is that while they are all MDIs, their challenges and the opportunities that they are looking at are all unique. And I think it's important to recognize that while they are unified in mission, their circumstances are different. And it's important for me as a state regulator to bear that in mind, particularly as we apply an oversight lens over these institutions. Number two, facilitate conversations where appropriate. I can also share with you the observation that has been relayed to me by a handful of our MDIs. They look at some of the they look at some of the technology solutions now in the marketplace and ask all these same questions. They ask questions about whether, in fact, these solutions hold any promise, whether any of these solutions would have the potential to exacerbate some of the issues around inequality. And what I say to them is the answer is yes, right? Again, the solutions are not monolithic, they are tools, right? But they are tools for us to understand and to leverage in order to solve our problems. So in my opinion, the answer has to involve some sense of governance. How are we going to apply these new technology solutions in a way that doesn't exacerbate some of the inequalities? And the last thing I would say is one thing that we've worked very hard to do here at the State Department is the State Department of Financial Protection and Innovation, is develop a bias toward oversight as opposed to preclusion. And here's what I mean. I think far too often the tendency amongst, I'll simply say some of my colleagues here in the state of California, is to look at something new and immediately reflexively react in a way that says, we've never seen that before. It doesn't comfortably fit within one of our rubrics. So we're going to preclude its ability to exist in the marketplace. And I think the better tendency would be to say, we've never seen this before, but we ought to talk about a sensible oversight regime. How do we allow this potential solution to prove itself out while maintaining our principles to consumer protection and safety and sound? So I think developing that kind of bias toward oversight versus preclusion is an important muscle to develop.
Well, I think I take your point there, and I also think before we end this conversation, I want to give everybody one last chance to say the most kind of strategic advantage, because we've talked a lot about the problems in the system, and I want to make sure Melissa gets a chance because the comptroller mentioned cash flow underwriting, which her agency's done a fantastic job talking about, and Dominique mentioned that as a solution. And yet we also have a reality where particularly smaller financial institutions go to make a loan on cash flow underwriting, and there's a regulator pointing and saying, what's that person's FICO? What's their credit score? And you have a marketplace that hasn't adapted to that. So you have a lot of structural impediments to changing, and I've called credit scoring the out-of-tune oboe the rest of the financial orchestra is in sync with. And Melissa has the data and the research, and Dominique seems to say it's less discriminatory. Whether it's cash flow underwriting or any other new technology or any other inherent advantage that minority depository institutions or CDFIs have to actually fix this problem so that when we regather here, whether it's 6 months or 6 years from now, we have a less discriminatory society and not a more discriminatory one. Because I know we're going to get the same plaudits that everybody's against racism and discrimination, but lo and behold, it continues to grow and metastasize in our society, despite everybody's quote unquote best efforts. So Melissa, why don't you start, and then I'll encourage everybody else on the panel to give their parting thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think our research and anecdotal information, but our empirical study shows we have an inclusion issue. Our data is insufficient in covering the up to 50% of the population who are nearly 30% African-American Hispanics, insufficiently credit risk assessing those communities and those populations. And so the way in which we're ultimately going to see industry embrace this, I think some of the efforts by the FDIC, by the OCC help, but more certainty around data privacy, data protection, and not just in the moment. What is consent? What is meaningful consent? Do these data fit under the Fair Credit Reporting Act or not? This comes back to Chairwoman Waters. There's congressional action needed in this area as well, but settling these uncertainties is going to make the difference in terms of how not only minority depository institutions and CDFIs go about using this data, and they are sitting close to populations who they can be delivering safe and affordable credit to, but ultimately informing the broader financial ecosystem, including depositories and the fintechs. So I'll leave that as my parting shot.
So I'll say that I think that alternative credit scoring has a lot of potential here. I think that we need to look at how we're looking at risk. I believe that risk is overstated for a lot of these groups, and that we really have to change the lens under which we're looking at them. I think there are lots of people that are working on this. We're grateful to work with Experian on this right now. I know there are several fintechs and other people who really want to find ways to offer second and third chances. We've got to figure out how to look at these people differently.
And I'm very encouraged by the task force that have been, spearheaded by Congresswoman Waters and thinking about these issues. And I really hope there's more investigation and research that is thoughtful about how these new systems, how this data and how these algorithms are impacting Black Americans, and that such federal agencies like HUD, FTC, Consumer Protection Financial Bureau are also looking to find solutions to address these issues, because they are prominent within Black and Brown communities. And we must ensure that there are regulations to hold companies accountable for their harm caused.
I don't believe, Aaron, that consumer protection principles are incompatible with responsible innovation. That's a fundamental tenet of how we seek to operate here in California. And I also think that we need to remember to skate to the puck where the puck is going, not where it's been. Yes, it's important it is important to preserve. It's absolutely important to preserve the history of MDIs and those institutions, those brick and mortar institutions that continue to do the good work within their communities. But let's remember where the puck is going. It's going here.
That's fantastic. I want to thank everybody for this great conversation, and I'm going to send the program back to Chris now and the next great conversation.